The Surprising Work of God by Jonathan Edwards. Chapter 1. A General History of the Revival. And several distinguished pastors and congregations in this region became aware of the wonderful work of God in Northampton, Massachusetts, the surrounding towns. They asked me to inform them of it in greater detail. Being a pastor in Northampton, I am quite familiar with many cases in which God has worked through and among the people during this revival. Through this book I hope to acquaint you with the details of this work, how now called the Great Awakening, and so, in as much just and faithful a manner as possible, I will proceed to show you God's hand in this wonderful work. I suppose that the general population of Northampton is as temperate, orderly, and good as people as any part of New England. Yet I believe they have been preserved from error and a variety of sects and opinions more than individuals in other areas. The fact that Northampton is so far inland, at a distance from seaports and in a more remote corner of the country, has doubtless been one reason that we have not been corrupted with vice to the degree that most other areas have been. But without question the religion and good order of the area and its purity in doctrine have, under God, been very much due to the great abilities and the eminent piety of my honoured grandfather, Reverend Stoddard. I hope that of all the communities in New England we have been freest from unhappy divisions and quarrels in our ecclesiastical and religious affairs, until the recent and lamentable Springfield contention. This contention consists of heated debates among both the pastors and the people on account of differing opinions concerning the principles of a certain minister, Robert Brick. There has been much arguing over the steps taken to procure the particular minister's ordination. Because Northampton is separated from other parts of the province and is comparatively little connection with them, we have always managed our ecclesiastical affairs among ourselves. It is the way in which the county from its infancy has gone on, by the practical agreement of all. This is the way in which our peace and good order have been maintained. The town of Northampton is about 82 years old, and now, in 1736, it has about 200 families, which tend to dwell more compactly together than any town of such a size in this part of the country. This probably has been the reason that both our corruptions and reformations have been from time to time more swiftly propagated from one to another through the town. The town in general, as far as I can judge, is comprised of rationally and intelligent people. Many of them have been noted for religion and for their distinct knowledge in things that relate to heart religion and Christian experience. I am the third minister who has settled in the town. The Reverend Eliezer Mather, who was the first, was ordained in July 1669. He was one whose heart was very much in his work, and his labours for the good of precious souls were abundant. He had a high esteem and great love for his people, and was blessed with great success. My grandfather, the Reverend Stoddard, who succeeded him, first came to the town in November after Reverend Mather's death. However, Reverend Stoddard was not ordained until September 11, 1672. Records show that he died February 11, 1729, after continuing in the work of the ministry here for nearly 60 years. As Reverend Stoddard was eminent and renowned for his gifts and grace, so was he blessed from the beginning with extraordinary success in his ministry. Many souls were converted under his leadership. He had 5 harvests, as he called them. The first was about 57 years ago, the second about 53, and the third about 40, the fourth about 24, and the fifth and last about 18 years ago. Some of these times were much more remarkable than others, and the ingathering of souls more plentiful. The harvests of about 53, 40, and 24 years ago were much greater than either the first or the last. In each of them I have heard my grandfather say, the greater part of the young people in the town seemed to be the ones concerned about their eternal salvation. After the last of these harvests, there came a far more degenerate time, at least among the young people, than ever before. Reverend Stoddard had the comfort, before he died, of seeing a time of divine work among some and a considerable ingathering of souls. This occurred even after I was settled with him in the ministry, which I was about 2 years before his death, and I have reason to bless God for the great advantage I received from it. In those 2 years there were nearly 20 people who were converted under Reverend Stoddard, but there was no general awakening at any time. At that time the greater part of the people seemed to be insensible of the things of religion and engaged in other cares and pursuits. Just after my grandfather's death, it seemed to be a time of extraordinary dullness in religion. Lasciviousness prevailed among the youth of the town. Many of them were addicted to walking the streets at night with evil intentions, to frequenting the taverns and to lewd practices. Some, by their example, corrupted others, and was frequently in their manner to get together for mirth, frivolity, in meetings of both sexes, which they called frolics, and they would often spend the greater part of the night in them, without regard for any other in the families they belonged to. Indeed, family government did fail in the town during that time. It became customary for many of our young people to conduct themselves indecently during church services, a practice that would not have prevailed to such a degree if my grandfather had been able to observe them as he once had. Because of his great age, though he retained many of his abilities to the last, he was not able to watch over them so carefully. A spirit of contention between two parties had also long prevailed in the town, which had been divided for many years. Their division allowed them to maintain a jealousy toward one another, and they were prepared to oppose one another in any public affairs. Yet 2 or 3 years after Reverend Stotter's death, there began to be an obvious amendment to those evils. The young people showed more of a disposition to listen to counsel, and little by little they abandoned their silly meetings. Their conduct during public worship grew observably more decent, and they were more to displayed a religious concern than there had been before. Near the end of the year 1733, the young people were here began to show a very unusual flexibility and yielding to advice. For a long time it had been their habit to make Sunday evenings after our public lecture a time for mirth and company keeping, although it had never been our custom to observe Monday evenings as part of the holy time, but rather Saturday evenings. A sermon was now preached concerning the evil tendency of the youth's practice. They were urged to reform it, and parents were urged to govern their families with more care and to keep their children at home during these times. The heads of families were so encouraged to meet together the next day that their various neighbourhoods to understand each other's minds. It was done accordingly, and the plan was complied with throughout the town. However, parents found little or no reason to exercise authority over their children in this case. Young people were already convinced by what they had heard from the pulpit and were willing to comply with the counsel that had been given. The preacher's advice was immediately and, I suppose, almost universally complied with. As a result, there was a thorough reformation of these disorders at that time, which had continued ever since. Almost immediately after this, a remarkable religious concern appeared in a little village called Pascomock, where a few families were settled about 3 miles from the main part of the town. At this place, a number of people seemed to be under the saving influence of the Holy Spirit. In April 1734, a young man there, in the bloom of his youth, died a very sudden and awful death. He had been violently seized with pleurisy and had immediately become delirious. He died in about 2 days, which, along with what was preached publicly on that occasion, affected many young people. This was followed by the death of a young married woman who had, before she was ill, had been considerably troubled in mind about the salvation of her soul. She was in great distress in the beginning of her illness, but seemed to have satisfying evidence of God's mercy to her before her death. She died full of comfort, in a most earnest and moving manner, warning and counseling others. It seemed to contribute to sobering in the spirits of many young people in the town, and more of a religious concern began to occupy people's minds. In the fall of that year, I strongly urged young people to agree among themselves to spend evenings after lecture in social religion. To that end, I suggested that they divide themselves into several companies to meet in various parts of the town. It was done accordingly, and those meetings were continued ever since, and the example has been imitated by older people. It was followed by the death of an elderly person who was accompanied by many unusual circumstances, causing many to be moved and affected. Round this time a great noise began in this part of the country concerning Arminianism, which seemed to threaten the interests of religion here. Arminianism opposes the absolute predestination in which Calvin believed. Those who practiced vital piety trembled in fear of the controversy's result. But it seemed, contrary to their fear, that Arminianism was strongly overruled by the promoting of religion. Many who considered themselves to be on the Christless condition seemed to be awakened by the controversy. They feared that God was about to withdraw from the land, that he would be given up to unorthodox and corrupt principles, and that then their opportunity for obtaining salvation would be past. Many who began to doubt the truth of the doctrines that they had been taught beforehand seemed to have a kind of trembling fear along with their doubts, lest they should be led into obscure paths towards their eternal ruin. And with much concern and fixedness of mind they seemed eager to find out what was necessary for them to be accepted by God. On that occasion there were some things said publicly concerning justification by faith alone. Although it was considered a great fault after the pulpit to be found meddling with the controversy at that time, and though it was ridiculed by many elsewhere, it proved to be a word spoken in season here. A very remarkable blessing came from heaven to the people in Northampton because of it. They received from the pulpit a satisfying answer to the main thing in question, about which they had much doubt and concern. Now their minds were engaged even more earnestly to seek acceptance with God, and to be saved in a way of the gospel, for they had come to see the gospel as true and only way.